Monsieur le ministre des Affaires sociales.
Could I possibly ask the Minister of Welfare to come here to the panel? And then I would like to invite also Ms. Aija Barča and Mr. Stephen Tobin to come up here. Mr. Minister, we have started debates already with Mrs. Prime Minister, and now I give you the floor, and then we shall listen to the chairman of the Parliament, and then Mr. Stephen Tobin. Good morning, as the Prime Minister, Mrs. Laimdal-Straujuma, mentioned, when we organize these debates in various formats on very concrete aspects of the investment plan, on the 9th of March, the EPSCO was organized a discussion of ministers on the investment plan, and in the development of human capital, including qualitative and long-term job creation and social inclusion. The employment situation and social matters certainly cause concern, because recovery is slow and we haven't got any recovery in the labor market. In December, the EU 28 member states had the unemployment rate 9.7%, which means that more than 24 million Europeans have no jobs. Half of them are long-term jobless, and many young people among them. That's why I call upon the ministers to exchange opinions on possibilities to use the potential of the investment plan in accordance with the priorities of the plan and our needs, both at the EU and national level, and also to look at how the member states can enhance the positive effect of the investment plan. During the discussions of the ministers, Mr. Katainen and Commissar Tysonen also participated, and we focused on investments that could be there in infrastructure, especially on strategic investments in the digital sector, energy industry, in accordance with the priorities of the EU, and also transport infrastructure. It is also important for investments to be enhanced in education, research, innovations, and the development of human capital. We have been preparing for these discussions with ministers. We enjoyed the contribution that was given to us by the ILO and its statement on the influence of the investment plan on employment. The statement of the ILO stresses that there are conditions, if they are successfully implemented, may increase the potential of the creation of new jobs as part of the investment plan. The ILO has calculated that the investment plan could create 2.1 million new jobs. In order to achieve it, it is important to increase the investments of the private sector and also SMEs, and also give a contribution, make a contribution to the improvement of skills of workers. A very positive influence on employment is a fact that may increase the implementation of the investment plan. Ministers of Employment and Social Policy of the member states were of the same opinion that investments play the role of a catalyzer in the public sector investments, and the involvement of the private enterprise is very important and may increase the creation of new jobs. Ministers also emphasized that the great significance of human capital development and training. The implementation of the investment plan certainly shows that investments promote growth, competitiveness, and new jobs, which is important. It is also important that they should be qualitative. That is why Latvian presidency have been stressing the quality of the jobs and the long-term and inclusive participation in the labor market. It is also important to support various measures for risk groups, long-term jobless, the disabled people and young people. All these groups need much easier access to the labor market. These questions are closely connected with such EU member states, also Latvia, that have topical problems such as inequality of income, poverty of the workers, and social exclusion. In order to overcome long-term unemployment and decrease poverty, it is really important to provide that the employment services should work very well, and there should be social support. To round it up, I would like to say that all the involved parties, the governments, the employers and the workers have got lots to do in order to provide it that the investment will make our world more competitive and socially just. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Mrs. Aija Barča from the Parliament of Latvia. Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honored to participate today in the extraordinary meeting of the workers group of the European Economic and Social Committee. I'd like to extend my gratitude for the opportunity on behalf of the Commission for Social and Employment of the Parliament, also to contribute to the agenda. I will focus in my address on the social policy, including the employment policy and its implementation process, and the conclusions we've come to, as well as the participation of Latvia as a presiding country in the implementation of social investment plan that will ensure the creation of quality jobs. At the same time, I would like to stress that in these processes, it's essential to have contribution and common work of all the involved parties. At the moment, we are in a situation when the social dimension of the economic and monetary union is not an abstract vision, but actual necessity, and Latvia as the presiding country in the Council works on ensuring that Europe receives the required support as soon as possible for development of economy and competitiveness that is aimed at ensuring sustainable growth. Our common task today is, during the Latvian presidency, is particularly topical, although at the European Union level, we must also achieve unity, and we should implement also a package of employment and growth and investments. And you know that quite a lot of people put high hopes on that. This investment implementation process must be managed properly, not to lose the right moment, and also to have the political will for the required improvements. One of them is related to the necessity to balance the aspects of employment and social support by macroeconomic and financial issues. In view of the current seriousness of the economic, social, and geopolitical situation, politicians should take into account that the unemployment problem do not have immediate solutions. Moreover, it's quite important to have solidarity, horizontal as well as vertical solidarity. That means solidarity among all EU member states, not only solidarity between South Europe and the new member states. So there are various factors of national economy that influence development. That is well-channeled. Investment capital, innovation, sustainable economic development are among those factors. In a situation where the macroeconomic background is not favorable, it is important to stimulate a dynamic approach to activate the labor force, including providing training in future professions with employability potential by establishing a close link with educational programs. In the event of structural reforms, the result is not always seen immediately. In most cases, it requires quite a long time. So the impact assessment becomes all the more important. That applies also to various support measures to really use the available funding in a targeted and effective way, and the required resources should be established in proportion and in a growth-friendly way. Also, well-considered and thought-over investments in lifelong learning, in productivity, innovations, following the experience we gained through the crisis, undeniably are considered to be stimulating for growth, and in combination with additional investments, such a solution will bring more benefit to the population in Europe, ensuring not only the growth of the quantitative indicators of employment, as well as the quality and sustainability of jobs. It is important for inclusive and sustainable growth in the European Union to have a well-balanced public and private investment program. All the EU member states should have options to use financial instruments according to their most essential needs. At the same time, it must be guaranteed that investments for the implementation of these projects create new jobs, thus stimulating the development of human capital, employment, as well as fight against poverty, thus providing more social security to the population in Europe. In this context, it's important to create favorable conditions and terms for enterprises to enable them to develop their activities in a sustainable and responsible manner. It's important to support the small and medium enterprises, which play the main role in job creation. To achieve these ends, it's important to improve the application of the existing social dialogue instruments and find solutions for closer involvement of social partners in consolidating the social dimension of the economic and monetary union. A close involvement of social partners is also necessary within the processes of strategic management governance of European 2020 at the European level as well as national level, in line with the situation and practice of each member state. That's why I'm glad that the European Economic and Social Committee, that has long-standing experience in strengthening the social dialogue and the civic dialogue, and in particular the workers' group of this committee, pay considerable attention to implementation of investment plan, and this discussion is also dedicated to the social impact of the investment plan that is understandable and important for the population of Europe. I wish good luck to participants of the meeting, to Mr. President. Thank you for attention. Thank you, Mrs. Barča. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Stephen Tobin, who will bring light to us on some issues. We have worked for quite a long time to be able to appreciate his work and also to implement his work in legislation. We have also used his research findings several times, and we have also submitted to the European Commission various proposals. However, Mr. Stephen Tobin will now speak about
the ILO to participate in this, I think, important conference to discuss some of the main priorities, I think, going forward. In particular, of course, the investment strategy, but really how to make the most of this, some would say, small plan. I would also like to thank, I think, our distinguished panel members who really emphasized, I think, three important points. The first one is that growth remains weak in Europe, unemployment remains stubbornly high, and we need some plan to sort of kickstart competitiveness and job creation. And if I could add one final point, it would be that this idea that competitiveness would be restored by cutting wages and cutting social protection clearly has not worked, and we need something else, some other idea, as modest as it may be, to go forward. And so I think my role here today is perhaps to give you a little bit more detail on the plan and how we think you can make modest improvements to a modest proposal to get the most for job creation. In particular, I think I'll touch very briefly on some of the labor market challenges, the magnitude. The minister mentioned a few of them, but also maybe add a little bit of context as to why this investment plan matters in addition to the investment shortfall that exists today. But then really to sort of focus as much as I can on how to make this plan work, and also to think about some of the issues and considerations for you and other policymakers in terms of what next in terms of the follow-up with respect to the plan. Only very briefly to say that the recovery remains particularly weak in the EU 28. There has been a modest improvement with respect to the forecasts from last autumn, But this is really mostly a reflection of the fact that last autumn things looked in particular dismal. I think two important things to note from this picture is that, one, the growth in Europe really stands in stark contrast to that of the US, where in 2015 growth in the US is expected to reach close to 4%, whereas in Europe it remains around 1.5%. A second note of particular concern I would highlight is that some of the larger economies in Europe now, in particular France and Italy, are weakening. That is to say, they have growth rates of 1% or less expected for 2015, which, needless to say, raises considerable concerns for some of the smaller economies, especially with respect to job creation. The minister mentioned 24 million, or nearly 24 million, unemployed in Europe. Only again to note very quickly that in US and Japan, the job recovery has been taking place since 2010, so they have experienced already 5 years of employment growth, whereas the EU continues to struggle with unemployment rates near double-digit figures. I would also re-emphasize even the point the minister mentioned with respect to long-term unemployment. Nearly half, and to put a figure again on the 12 million people have been looking for a job for more than a year. 12 million for more than a year. I mean, I think just to digest that for a second, that you are looking for a job unsuccessfully for more than a year, is really, I think, a cause for significant economic, social, fiscal, societal challenges going forward, unless really something is done to keep these people close to the labor market. We know that from past, more minor crises, if you will, that skills continue to erode, especially for some of the young, well-educated individuals entering the labor market. There is a stigma that becomes associated with someone who's been out of a job for more than a year. It becomes increasingly difficult for them to find a job vis-a-vis more recent entrants to the labor market who have been unemployed for less time. Some of them are forced to leave the labor market altogether. They give up hope. And with respect to some of the fiscal considerations, these people end up on social assistance or other income assistance for a very long time, and it becomes very expensive to bring them back into the labor market and maintain them there. And I think this is really, if I could highlight, a very important consideration in terms of how the plan is designed going forward. One problem to
Viena problēma, kas ir jāatzīmē attiecībā uz šiem 12 miljoniem ilgtermiņa bezdarbniekiem, ir tas, ka ir nepieciešams atbalsts, lai viņus paturētu darba tirgū, bet tas iet uz...
Only a quarter of those job seekers are in some sort of what I would call an activation measure, and roughly 7% are in some sort of training. And you may say, well, training for what particular job? But the reality is, as I mentioned, it's important to keep them attached to the job market, keep their skills up to date as much as possible, but also to have in place parallel efforts to stimulate the economy, which are not associated with, as I mentioned at the beginning, wage cuts. And this is why the investment plan, in our mind, is very important. And today, investment in Europe remains considerably well below the 2007 levels, close to 16%. Whereas in the Japan and US, which have had more modest job recoveries, investment has more or less or close to reached levels from 2007, which of course is the impetus for the investment plan. But what I would like to remind everyone is that even before the crisis, the investment situation wasn't really that great, to be honest, in Europe. And some have argued, as you know, that the investment patterns, in some instances, that were allocated towards less what I would call productive or innovative investment was part of the reason for the crisis. And so when you look at the 7 years before 2007, we see that investment in ICT was actually falling in Europe and falling considerably in countries like Spain and Greece, whereas in Germany and the United States, it had been increasing. Now, investment of this nature, of course, is not a solve-all solution, but it's an important reminder that going forward, the quantity of investment is important, but also quality, much like job creation. And so that's why we welcome this plan and its initiative to really focus on two areas. One, of course, job creation, but two, on productive investment. The one caveat that I would add, however, is that it must in some way take into account not only this past behavior of investment, but it must also take into account some of the existing disparities with respect to investment allocation in Europe. Here, for instance, if I look at the investment allocation of the EIB between 2007 and 2013, most of the money was directed towards countries with low unemployment, nearly half, whereas a little more than a quarter or a third was allocated towards high unemployment countries. Now, yes, one of the conditions of EIB financing is to have a very strong private sector, and so part of this would make sense in terms of why the money was allocated towards low unemployment countries. But I would like to argue that in many instances, the high unemployment countries where investment was really concentrated in a few low productive sectors, financing, allocation, investment, and transformation was most needed in these countries. And therefore, it raises a question going forward about how some of this money could be allocated. And here, I just note that Greece received a very, very small portion of EIB funding during the crisis period, in the order of the same magnitude as Austria. And so this is why we propose an employment-oriented strategy to the investment plan. And here we've developed a few scenarios which gives you an idea of the employment impact that is capable from this plan. And the first scenario, of course, is really what we call the lower bound scenario. That is to say, imagine that there would be no leverage from the private sector. And here we see that only 400,000 jobs would be created. I like to see this scenario as basically, even if the private sector money were to come in the order that it is anticipated, but it were money that would have been spent anyway, this is the type of impact that we would get, thus raising the importance of leveraging new money, as was mentioned this morning. The second one is the full-fledged plan, but by allocating the money according to the size of the GDP. And here we see that we could create 1.8 million jobs, but that the job gains are, if we could say, disproportionately associated with low unemployment countries, thus exacerbating potentially the disparity that already exists, noting we have unemployment rates of 5% and 25% in the European Union. The third scenario is what we call job-friendly distribution. Now, this is an allocation which in some ways only gets you 200,000 more jobs, but 200,000 nevertheless is a lot of jobs for many people. But it is allocated based on 50% of GDP, but also 50% in terms of the magnitude of unemployment, such that countries which have high levels of unemployment as a proportion of total unemployment would get more. And here we see then the difference between the light and the blue. The allocation towards high and low is what I would call more evenly distributed. And the final scenario we take is if we were to take the existing envelope of money, not to add new money, but to take a very small portion of that and allocate it towards training and other measures that I mentioned at the beginning, which are really urgently needed to keep the 12 million, the 24 million people attached to the labor market. So simply by a small reallocation, we would get a net addition of 100,000 jobs. Taking some of these considerations in mind, how does the current plan stack up against the US and Japan? Of course, its magnitude and size over the 3-year period is modest compared to Japan and US, but in defense of the investment plan, it is by definition only an investment plan, whereas in the US and Japan this was really a full, comprehensive stimulus plan, if you will. Two things I would like to take note in terms of moving forward with respect to the plan is that in Japan and the US, both plans included some element to target vulnerable groups, the long-term unemployed that we've been talking about, or the low-skilled. And so this is, I think, an important consideration we should think about moving forward in terms of the plan's implementation. A second point, and this was mentioned by another panel colleague, is the importance of impact evaluation. This was a key component of the US plan, not only in terms of its impact in terms of growth, but also in terms of jobs. What sort of jobs are being created? What sort of spillover effects are being created by investments in certain areas? And I think this is really an important consideration going forward. So to summarize, I would say that it is key to think about the past in terms of investment patterns and really to leverage the plan towards more productive investment. Two, if we can, as much as possible, to include some form of active labor market policies as part of this plan, it will do enormous benefit not only to job creation, but to society more generally. And it will pay dividends in the future, I guarantee you. Some of you may not remember, but back in 2005, I was in the employment ministry in Canada. We spent days and nights trying to figure out how we can bring back people who've left the labor market, people with disabilities, people with low skills, women, and we realized it was extremely costly. So I raised the question that let's also not be short-sighted about what's needed today, but let's also think about the future and how we can keep these marginalized groups part of the labor market and part of society, because the cost of inaction is very, very high. And finally, to the extent possible, if we could include some sort of impact evaluation with respect to the plan, I think this will go a long ways in terms of informing policymakers, I think, going forward. And this is something that has been absent, I think, in much of the discussions so far. Thank you very much, and I wish you a successful day in discussions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Tobin, de cet excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much Mr. Tobin, thank you for the excellent presentation, and thanks for the President. And now we shall start debates. We have here a mic going round, and you'll be able to get the floor if you wish to. I would like to congratulate our colleagues, for example, Vitalis Gavrilovs and Peters Kriegers, Mr. Peters Kriegers. And I hope that Mr. Werter will participate. He will replace another speaker who represents the employer confederation. And now I would like to the debates, and as a continuation, we shall be able to debate, and then we shall be able to get a survey, make a survey at the end. Mr. Gabriel Bishop is also, and Ms. Grazina. Let us start immediately. And please try to be brief and to the point so that we have a creative dialogue. Thank you very much.
No?
So, now, because all the information we received from Mrs. Prime Minister and Mr. Minister were sort of incomplete. Mr. Minister, do you really think that Juncker's plan may achieve those aims that were identified? Perhaps you do not remember, because your country was not in the Union, but when the Lisbon strategy was started, which envisaged 20 new jobs, 20 million jobs, actually turned out to be not true. Actually, it was all smoke. Now, perhaps it will happen to Mr. Juncker's plan if it stays along main lines the same way as it is now, as there are forces, in particular the trade unions, that insist that this investment plan is to be implemented. I think it's a small present that will not come in handy for anyone. I believe the main problem today to have any growth, and I believe that applies to Mr. Tobin as well, is that Europe, irrespective of all the political, economic, and social errors that we have permitted, perhaps will start some movement forward only now, but without employment. This is a statement that we can make on the basis of most recent facts. Perhaps we will have growth without employment, contrary to what is going on in the United States, where the primary aim is to create jobs. And that's why, Mr. Tobin, the data that were mentioned by him, there is a high risk that they will not come true. And if we speak about the European goals and targets, they are negligible in comparison to what we really have to achieve. So what else should Europe do? Thank you. Now, Thank you, Mr. President. What I would like to say is that we have not yet completely recovered from the crisis. There's still some slight movement, and that is because the oil prices are falling, and the euro should not be too strong against the dollar, and the situation does not create any jobs. We view this plan positively, but we also know the constraints of the plan, for example, in respect of employment. What is mentioned is actually only 10% of what we should achieve. When we speak about the fact that this plan should achieve a situation that there is quality employment, it means that there should be good salaries. Social partners play a significant role not only in training, but they should also start speaking about salaries. That's a very important factor of economic growth and recovery. My question is, if we want these investments to be of the kind that generate employment, should not we achieve the situation that governments also seek and look for resources and funds? We should start to speak about fiscal equality. So this is not mentioned at the European Union level. It's very difficult for us to reach unanimity on these matters, but if we fail to do this, then investments might just become speculations, and there'll be unfair competition, because very often there are investors who do not want to create any wealth at all. Thank you, Anne.
On the investment plan from an Eastern European perspective, because this is what I know best. We are in Latvia, and sometimes we discuss about the situation of the infrastructures in our countries. We make huge efforts to connect the Eastern European countries with the Western European countries, but not always we succeed to connect the Eastern European countries among them, so to make the North-South infrastructures which are necessary. I suppose this can create huge opportunities in plan of investment. And I want to use this opportunity to, to congratulate and to Latvian Presidency for the fact that has proposed an own initiative opinion, an opinion of the European Economic and Social Committee related to the Central Asia relations between the European Union and Central Asian states, where we discussed a lot about the opportunities which might arise connecting infrastructure between the Eurasian countries and Western Europe. So I suppose one of the points of this investment plan can be this aspect of the energy and transport infrastructure. And the last question is related to the Latvian minister. How was the procedure, the consultation procedure, when was about the Juncker plan? The civil society organization, the trade unions, the employers, has been consulted when the Latvian government has sent this list of priority, because in our case, for example, in Romania, I do not know such a consultation. So this is one of the question marks related to the democracy when it's to talk about the future investments that we need in Europe. Thank you very much.
Merci, Dimitru. Mario.
Thank you, Dimitru. Marie-Hélène, please.
But I'm wondering, if the EIB doesn't have a social target in its statutes and says quite publicly that if they put employment issues on their calendar for investment, they will lose their AAA rating, and thereby they cannot do so. If private investors or structural investors have over the past years invested in very safe bonds or obligations or whatever, what will trigger them to do differently? So I would say that we have two very pragmatic problems if we want investment to deliver good quality jobs. First of them is the statutes and the AAA rating of the EIB. And the second one, if we want structural investors to invest within Europe, I would say several promises have been made. The rumors I have heard about those promises do not bode well for employment issues. What can be done in such a short time frame to change that? Thank you.
Merci, Marie-Hélène. Wolfgang.
Thank you, Marie-Hélène.
Ja, danke. Eine Frage an den Herrn Minister und eine Frage an nur mir fehlt
A question. I believe that we need to promote qualitative jobs in Europe. Over the last 10 years, we have had many people
we do not have any growth if we reduced the amount of work and increase employment, whether we will have any results, for example, practices and, well, restricted jobs. I don't know what this quality employment might be. What should be done to ensure that this movement could be turned the other way around? And as concerns the presentation by Mr. Tobin, thank you for your presentation. Where is it planned to make investments in the European Union, and where are those instruments that would really stimulate quality employment? Projects that are offered for choice or that have been selected, will they really ensure quality employment? Well, the comparison was interesting that you made between the United States and Europe. I also have doubts whether this program proposed by Mr. Juncker will really achieve the intended results. If we depend on the private investments and if the state will have to assume responsibility, will not the state become also, in the end of the day, the investor? And will it not be the main factor that the state also becomes the guarantor? Perhaps it is the barrier why in the United States this leverage effect has been higher and its impact has been more sizable. And if we stimulate really investments made by the state, how we should proceed? Let's have a look at strategic future-oriented investments. I believe the policy in Europe is that we have to economize, and yet at the same time we do not forecast employment. I don't think it's policy that will be successful. We need measures that will change it. The so-called golden rule that we envisage strategic investments and it's not included into the calculation of the national budget deficit. Thank you very much. I would like to link my question to the previous question. If we look at this project in its entirety, these 4 scenarios that you mentioned seem very interesting to me. It seemed to me that if we really want to have an intensive growth of jobs, there should be a criterion for the selection of projects. And an issue that we discuss in Europe is also the impact assessment. And that's my question is, shouldn't we at first ensure that these projects are linked with the impact assessment? And it's pointed out how many new jobs are projected, and also the ministers for employment review these matters, because it's very important that it's already attempted to ensure that there are no external influences on the selection of these projects, and that project experts should be neutral, and perhaps it might be the weakest link, or the chain, and what ideas and what understanding there is to change anything and what new proposals there might be. Thank you very much.
Country representative, and I am quietly happy when Latvian Prime Minister said that he must listen to social partners, and I feel that this reality is not empty words. And if to go to another reports, it's very useful to be here and to listen about ILO research this report, and of course it's depends of us what is the role of social partners in this Juncker plan, a role in Europe and the role what we can play in our countries. I agree with colleague from Romania that it's big difference between East countries and the countries, as we call old Europe, Union members, and we must to make the same rules. And our main aim is welfare for all citizens in Europe, and we must to know more, to share experience. What is going now in Lithuania, scientists propose to reorganize all systems, social and labor system in Lithuania. And for me, it's very useful today to know more about what is going in the world, in Europe, and with our colleagues to speak and to use arguments opposite. But of course it can be in another way with consultations. It will be more easy for us. Thank you.
Merci, Grazina. Bernd Fallenkamp, EP.
Thank you, Grazina. And now I will give the floor to 2 more speakers, please.
How do you explain the very big difference between the US strategy and the EU strategy when we talk about investment plans?
Ça c'est clair. Janusz Weltner.
Thank you, President. I have 2 questions. One is linked with the
previous question.
A question to Janusz.
No problem when analyzing the US and European and Japanese GDP and investment plans regarding that these other two countries have just a national level statistics. And here in Europe we have the national level and the EU level statistics. Doesn't it make any bias in the analysis? And do you think that if it would be a European level strategy, is the EU, the Commission, in the position to influence the national level strategies according to your advices? And the other question is that when looking, that's to the minister, the Latvian minister, that when speaking about the unemployment as a problem, as a social problem, can we take in account the migration between the countries, the migration from the high jobless rate countries to the low jobless rate countries? Also regarding that the education is quite different in some countries. The education does not support the education for the existing job market, and this type of jobs can import migrants from the donor countries, typically from the eastern countries. Does it influence somehow the strategy? I don't know if it was clear enough what I'm asking.
Thank you very much, Janusz. Voilà, Monsieur le Ministre, Madame la Présidente, Monsieur Tobin.
Tātad, here we have a whole list of things for consideration, and now I shall give the floor to you, Mr. Minister, to take these questions, and then we shall listen to Ms. Barča and also Mr. Tobin.
Jā, paldies, jautājumi bija.
Thank you very much. There are many questions and they were very interesting. I've tried to put them down. I'll take them in turn. Is in respect of Mr. Juncker's plan, while it might seem a detail that nothing will come out of it, I believe that what we have already achieved in respect of Mr. Juncker's plan and the implementation and the criteria that the Latvian presidency has decided to do is already much, and I'm an optimist. I see that these investments are necessary for the EU in order to get out of the stagnation that we're in at present. And I'm interested to see in the future that we had such Juncker's plan, but that we will enjoy the fruit from this plan in the future. That's why these discussions are very important in between the EU governments and the Commission and the employers and the employees. Only together can we find the right decision, the right trends that would be transparent to achieve a common goal, to increase jobs, to decrease poverty in Europe. That is our common objective. There were questions about the government. Perhaps they need to find the means and the funding. I remember on the 9th of March there were debates among ministers, and one of them said everybody has money except the governments that have no money. That's why it's important that we attract the investments that are in banks that haven't been used and provide the possibility to use them and invest them in qualitative jobs. And the question was, what is a qualitative job? It means, first of all, it must be well paid. Secondly, it must be long-term. for a year to 10 years ahead. We want this plan to work already, start working tomorrow. Well, of course, it doesn't happen tomorrow by noon. We need preparation for everything, and we need work performed at the criteria how this investment plan could possibly work. There was also a question about member states that have no discussions at present. I believe that the initiatives of this presidency and the Commission and also Vice President of the Social Dialogue, these are the bodies that will give a push to these social partners. Yesterday's conference proved that it is a good dialogue, and we have learned that we solve our problems together by sitting down at table and trying to solve them, and we don't expect anybody else to solve them or expect other people to do it. These are investments that we need in infrastructure, in the energy sector, because that would give jobs, to provide production, to provide infrastructure that will remain and will keep producing jobs. About their objectives, is the EIB an objective? We need these criteria and multipliers, and they should be correct, that would achieve the aim. We know the aim that we want to achieve, all those who sit here in this hall. Then about qualitative jobs, another remark. We need to remember that technologies develop, and the society is aging. We need a different practice, different training. We need to improve the education system so that we could create the employers who would be ready to work in the modern society. A few years ago, we could send an SMS with a telephone, but now there's a computer in it. We can't think about our life without a telephone and iPod. All this is something we have discussed together with the ministers, and each minister have got examples of good practice. I've always emphasized we don't have to reinvent the wheel. In many cases, and also in social dialogue, we forget the good old things that work before we invent something new. Of course, the remaining 3 months of Latvian presidency is very intensive work at all these criteria, and we get assistance from the International Employer Confederation, and we use their research during the discussions of ministers, and this research shows the big difference between us and the other world, as Mr. Tobin will tell us why are these strategies so very different in Europe and in America. To sum it up, I can say I believe that this is the right direction that we have to go for if we want to get Europe out of stagnation, and as soon as possible we need to provide an increase in qualitative jobs. I'm concerned by what's happening to our young people, because the unemployed young people constitute a big percentage, and many young people have poor education, and that is connected with migration. They try to go to another country to do some low-qualified jobs because we have no education, they have no practical knowledge. They do they're engaged in low-qualified jobs, and they have no practice while in education. That's a big shortcoming. We see that many young people need to be taught how to write an application, how to do their CV, and if they know that, that would be an encouragement to go to the labor market. Last year, we started employment of pupils, of school students during the holidays. They need to think what they are going to do for the whole of their remaining lives and how they will get into the labor market. I hope I've taken all your questions. If not, I'm ready to amplify.
Pour vous interroger, on voulait...
Thank you, Mr. Minister. It's important to involve young people into the dialogue. When commenting on other questions, also about the fiscal policies, we know that competition may be dishonest, and tax rates do not support investments as well. There are such cases. If you wish to comment on these points, you're welcome. Also, there's a commentary on Mr. Tobin's presentation about the division. It's unequal in between various regions in the world. As a minister of the presidency, you could say a few words perhaps on that. At least we could introduce them into the agenda. Well, that's not compulsory, but if you wish so, we are looking forward to your comment.
I think there were quite a number of questions. I start with probably my favorite Italian expression, is tanto fumo niente arrosto. So it's true that a plan cannot create jobs. A plan is just a plan. The point is that its implementation is very central to achieving its objectives. And is it the solve-all solution? No. Is it imperative? Absolutely, and I hope that my presentation demonstrated that not only from an investment quantity and quality perspective, but also in terms of jobs. And this is why, in terms of moving forward, it's really central to get this plan up and running as quickly as possible, while taking into account many of these employment considerations. And I think of the Youth Guarantee Scheme, announced 2.5 years ago, but yet to be implemented in many countries. And I think the lessons from that need to be taken really to heart with respect to the Juncker investment plan. And that is, yes, let's move forward quickly, but let's also get it right. And I think You know, there was a brief discussion with one of the presenters coming this afternoon that Europe in some ways is a bit like a Titanic. And the question is, what role can this investment plan play in helping to move the Titanic? And the point is, we need to make the most of what we have. And in that respect, the plan is going in the right direction. It talks about job creation, it talks about productive investment, but let's do everything we can to make the most of it in terms of the employment creation. Is it enough? No. So what are some other things that can be done? Yes, wages need to grow with productivity, something we've not seen in several years now. But in order for that to happen, there needs to be productivity. And then we're back to needing investment. Can countries also do some things in parallel? Yes, and I think they are doing them. There are many examples in Europe with respect to credit guarantees for SMEs, etc. And those efforts need to continue. But those are complements to the investment plan, not a replacement. How to ensure the allocation goes to where it really is needed? Unfortunately, I'm not welcome at the EIB anymore, but no, I'm kidding. But I think the point is, and this comes back to another question with respect to the impact evaluation. In the US plan, an employment evaluation or impact assessment was taken or took place before the decision was made whether or not to move forward. So that's one. So can we include this in the approval phase of the projects? What is the impact on employment? And of course, with respect to quality, next steps, there needs to be an evaluation following the implementation, monitoring, evaluation, where have the jobs been created, what types of jobs. But I would raise the question of, can we put in place a mechanism to evaluate the impact before it's approved, without stopping the whole machinery, I think. The other point, and this is a question I cannot answer, is whether or not there can be mechanisms in place to ensure that the pot of money is simply allocated based on, in some way, levels of unemployment currently, whether or not that's the 50% ratio I used in my scenario, or it's something else. So essentially, before you make any sort of approval process, one of the conditions is that a certain proportion of the funding would go to countries with higher levels of unemployment. Within that, of course, you still then need the assessment mechanisms. Is this the right project? Is it meeting the criteria? Does it create the jobs? But at the beginning, can something like that be envisioned? In terms of the US plan, you know, as I mentioned, it really is a bit of an unfair comparison because the size of the US plan was nearly triple. It was a comprehensive plan, and it endured for many, many years. And I would say what's most important within the context of what we're discussing today and the lessons from the US is, can we include some element of a labor market program or training or activation and target vulnerable groups as part of that? And I think that will go a long way to achieving some of the objectives we've mentioned here. This, I think, also answers the question that, well, yes, in some countries there isn't the education profiles of people needed, but then we need some support mechanisms to ensure that these people have the skills and training to succeed. And there are examples in my home country. For instance, there was the Canada Jobs Act, which was launched about a year ago. It was essentially a training program, which was 2/3 funded by the state, 1/3 to be funded by employers, but the pot of money would be allocated to an employer on the condition that they hire a person from long-term unemployment, a vulnerable group, and that they would train them for a job. So I think there are examples where we can combine vulnerability, training, and I think investment. I hope I've answered all your questions. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Tobin. Le dernier mot à Monsieur le ministre.
Jā, tā kā bija vēl jautājums.
So, as concerns the question of fiscal discipline and how it could impact, perhaps, unfortunately, or perhaps it's good luck that I, by profession, I'm financial manager. And in one of the questions that were raised, I heard the words that the government should also find some money. Well, most probably money must be earned because money doesn't grow on the trees. And I want to say that when we formulate the national budget, we have to be sufficiently reasonable. Unfortunately, in Latvia, we have experienced what it means not to be rational. When we want to live above our means, and then unfortunately we had to face the harsh reality and undertake quite harsh structural reforms. But in general, when we look back from point of today, it has given two results. This I can say about my sector, the social budget, where if we had not undertaken certain reforms, we might have brought our country to default. But this year and last year, it has given results. This is the first year when we have removed all restrictions because the social budget works with a surplus, and we start provisions for rainy days. So in actual fact, this direction has been correct in Latvia. But on the whole, I still would like to follow a reasonable fiscal policy. And that's why alongside with those opportunities and options that we have, not only in the field of investment, so meaning the investment plan, which is part of the growth potential, for myself, I can say I'm an optimist. And I believe that we will be able to stimulate growth. All issues should be discussed in a context. There will be no solution for all issues. We'll have a lot of work to do to reduce undeclared employment, unregistered employment, to educate the society, to develop a more professional, a wiser society, potentially guarantee better social security. All these are complex issues. They cannot be separated one from another, but we have to use all the opportunities in society that we perceive and we notice that will give us the overall growth of welfare on the whole of Europe. Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you for your time that you have dedicated to us. I wish you success, not only during the European Presidency, but also in your work in the office of Minister. And I will never forget that it's not possible to reach Europe without social justice. And Europe needs all these ideas to be moved forward to achieve this social justice. At any rate, a hand of applause to thank you for your participation in this dialogue, and thank you to Mr. Tobin. So I just congratulated also our welcomed our colleague János Vertes, and I would like to welcome our all other colleagues who follow our work. So Mr. Luis Planas, our Secretary General, asked to pass on his apologies. He wanted to participate in this meeting, but unfortunately he could not attend. And now I set the time at 11:30. We resume the meeting. We'll have discussions with various speakers and reporters. You'll have sufficient time to have refreshments and coffee. I'll be able to have a cigarette. And you will be able to have a taste of the excellent coffee our Latvian colleagues have provided. Let's meet at 11:30 in this hall. And we have a small souvenir that I'd like to present to Mr. Minister.